Hey class, today we're going to start on chapter 9. This is going to take us into new material. And this is a material that you want to keep in mind for writing assignment 1. So all the material we're going to get from here on up until the introduction of writing assignment 1 is, they're going to be connected. Writing assignment 1, it's part of the larger writing assignment, which I'll explain later on down the line. But you're going to be applying concepts that you learn in chapter 9 to the writing of a paper. So it's very important that you keep the concepts here in mind, that you learn them well, become competent in them, so that you can then later on apply them. Okay, so in chapter 9, we're dealing with an argument form called inference to the best explanation. And this is a form of inductive argument. And let's just remind ourselves what an inductive argument is. It's an argument that intends to provide probable support for a conclusion, such that if premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to be true. It's distinguished from deductive argument, which is a strong argument, which says that a conclusion must be true if the premises are true, right? And as we learned also about the evaluation of these arguments, they have different terminology. They are sort of related moves, but they're not quite the same, right? They're So when we're talking about good inductive arguments, we use the criteria of strength and cogency. So if a set of premises is providing support to a conclusion in an inductive argument in the right way, then it's a strong argument. Otherwise, it's weak. If the premises are true, then it's cogent. Otherwise, it's not cogent. So now, by way of review here, we're going to build on these concepts that we learned in the previous chapters. We made a distinction earlier between arguments and explanations, and an argument is a passage that gives us evidence or reasons for believing that a conclusion is true. Or probably true. It can be a deductive or an inductive argument. An example here is going to be that Adam obviously stole the money for 3 people saw him do it. So the evidence for this is that 3 people saw him do it. 4 is a premise indicator for what follows. And then the conclusion is that Adam obviously stole the money. In an explanation, you have something different going on. You don't have evidence or reasons being provided that something is true. Rather, you have, an explanation of why something is the case. Adam stole the money because he needed it to buy food. So in this passage here, that Adam stole the money is not in dispute. So now what the passage is doing is sort of explaining why it is that Adam stole the money, right? Why it is, that, what transpired happened. It's a different sort of passage, right? It has a different function. Okay, so now we want to learn a little bit more in depth what explanations, consist of, what are their components. Well, they have 2 components. In an explanation, there's going to be the explanandum, which is the thing to be explained. These are technical terms, right? Latin terms. The explanandum refers to the fact, the phenomenon that is to be explained, that needs explaining. And then the explanans is the thing that is doing the explaining. Now, it's really hard to remember these technical terms, right? Believe me, I've been doing it for a few years, and every time, I finally got a tip on how to remember these. So the explanandum is a singular, right? There's one thing to be explained, and then there might be, a variety of things doing the explaining. Explanans. So this is plural, right? Explanans. Anyways, don't worry too much about the terminology. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is that you get the concept. So what you want to distinguish in your mind, if you want to you can just sort of bracket this terminology and think about 2 things. Okay, think about an explanations having a part of it, a thing that requires to be explained, that needs to be explained, and then there's another thing which is doing the explaining, right? So here's a diagram that might help out with this. Now, in the first diagram, you have an argument, so the premises are accepted facts, right? The conclusion is not an accepted fact; it's something that needs to be proved, right? So the premises, the accepted facts, go on to prove the conclusion. And in an explanation, on the other hand, right? Notice that the thing that is being explained, the explanandum, is the accepted fact, right? So you're not trying to establish, it as a fact. It's an accepted fact. What the explanand is doing is it's claiming to shed light on the explanandum. Okay, so it's a different sort of thing that's going on there. It sort of increases our understanding, of some accepted facts, some phenomena. So we'll see. Here's a couple of examples of this. You want to be able to distinguish the thing that is being explained, the explanandum, from the thing that is doing the explaining, explanans. So take the first one. The sky appears blue because the sun's light rays are scattered by particles in the atmosphere. Right. So look, the explanandum here is that the sky is blue, right? Nobody disputes that the sky is blue. It's an accepted fact. The explanation is just shedding light on, what it is that we take as accepted fact. It's a matter of perception. We all see that the sky is blue. At least, those, I mean, there might be some colorblind folks, right? But, barring any special condition within the perceiver, right? The sky appears blue to the perceiver. So, the sun's light rays are scattered by particles in the atmosphere. As an explanation, it sheds light on why it is that the sky appears blue to us. Another explanation, golf balls have a dimpled surface because the dimples reduce air drag, causing the ball to travel further. So in this one here, the thing that's being explained is the phenomenon of golf balls having dimpled surfaces. Why? Okay, and then we have our final example here. Navel oranges are called by that name because they have an indentation that resembles a human navel on the end opposite the stem. So the explanandum here is going to be navel oranges are called by that name. Why are navel oranges called that way? So notice that in an explanation you typically have a because there, right? A premise. In an argument, because is a premise indicator. Remember that. So in an explanation, you have a because, but it's not a premise indicator. It is, sort of indicating that an explanation is to follow, right? So it comes, before the explanation, and that's what it indicates. Now, what this just goes to show is that these indicator words are not foolproof guarantees that you're going to have what you think they're indicating, right? So. Just because you have, a thus, sometimes thus is used, in a way that's not an indicator word. So that's not a conclusion. Here you have, premise indicator that's not used as a premise to indicate a premise. So, so it just depends on the passage itself. Those things are just, sort of, they help us to identify the components, of an argument, but they're not foolproof guarantee. You have to sort of, be careful with, with that. And make the determination, in relation to the particular passage you're looking at. Okay, so there's different types of explanations. There's procedural explanations, which explain how something is done. There's interpretive, which explain the meanings of states of affairs. Functional, which explain how something functions. Now, the one that we're interested in, that we're going to be interested in this chapter, is theoretical explanations. They are hypotheses. That explain why something is the way that it is. They also include causal explanations, right? So they are important to science. They're important to everyday life. There's a variety of different domains that practice, that use inference to the best explanation. These are the kinds of explanations that will be part of the argument form known as inference to the best explanation. Okay, so now explanations are not arguments that we've seen, but they can become a part of arguments, right? And inference is the best explanation, right? So they end up becoming in these argument forms a piece, a part of the overall argument. Okay, so this is what the form of one of these inferences to the best explanation looks like. In these three bullets here, you have the argument. So the first premise is phenomenon Q, and the second premise asserts that that some explanation E provides the best explanation for Q. Therefore, it is probable that E is true. Now, what you want to take notice here, in order to connect this, with the concept, you want to synthesize, this what's said here about the argument form with what we've said about explanations and their components. So you'll notice that in that inference to the best explanation there, the explanandum is the phenomenon. Okay, so the phenomenon is the accepted fact, and the explanans, is the thing doing the explaining this. So that one of the explanans is identified as the best one, but there's alternative. If you've identified a best one, then that means that there's others, right, which aren't as good. So you have a set of competing explanations, and a best one has been selected. Where the next part of this chapter is actually going to go over the evaluative criteria, which would allow us to select a best explanation from among competing explanations, or at least with criteria which would help us to do that. Okay, so now I'll give you before we move on, I'm going to give you an example of how these inferences to the best explanation, and we do them all the time, right? So in our everyday lives, but in law they do them. So about a year ago, there was a case of a nanny who was kidnapped and sexually assaulted in Fresno, and they were talking about the evidence for it. So the evidence was that the guy branded a knife wrapped in a towel, right? And he had done that in a previous incident. Another thing, he was wearing a hat, and this hat is the same one that he was wearing in a picture with his girlfriend. Okay, so there was just a variety of different kinds of evidence, which led to the to the conclusion that he probably is the guy who is the perpetrator of this sexual assault. And so what's going on there, right, is that this is an inference to the best explanation, right? You have the data, right, the phenomenon, right? So there's what happened to the witness. There's testimony in the part of what happened to not the witness but the victim. She was had a knife brandished at her with towel wrapped around it. This guy with the hat, same hat. There's there's a picture with his girlfriend where he's wearing the same hat. Right, there's some other circumstantial evidence. Okay, now what explains all of these things? One explanation is that it wasn't the guy. It was another guy who I'd like to wrap his knives in towels and brandish them. When he's engaged in in some kind of crime. Another is that this guy has a twin, right, and it's actually his twin. And so it's not him, or it's another guy that looks like him, right? But it's not him. And another explanation yet is that that it's him, right? So which one among these is the best explanation for that explains why this sexual assault happened? Well, the one that says that he did it, right? So that he is the perpetrator of the sexual assault is the best explanation for the phenomenon Q. Therefore, it's probable, right, that that he did it, and so they would have to go on in the court of law to prove all of that. But that's how that works. So another is there's a if you walk down the old administration building in Fresno City College, you have these doors that automatically open, right? Or if they open if you press a button, right? So I was walking past the hall, and I heard the door close, and and then I saw a student, way on the other side, of of the hall, right? And so, okay, so what is the explanation of, of this phenomenon, that I sort of heard the tail end, this process of the door, opening when you press the button, the door closed, I heard it close. Okay, who opened that door? Was it the student way across the hall? Did they just open the door and did a bunch of, fairies, sort of, carry them over, run over to the other side really quickly, or there's, a transporter, the person, transported from the door, the beginning of the hall to the end of the hall really quickly? Or did, is it the case that the door, opens and it happens to, take a few minutes for it to close. So that gave enough time for the student to walk to the other side of the hall. Or is it the case, that some student, hit the button, the door opened, they walk to the left, so I can no longer see them. I just happen to see some other student who had nothing to do with it. All right, which one of these explanations is the best? Well, we're going to learn how to select for the best one here, and we do this intuitively all the time, right? I mean, who believes that fairies, did this, or that there was a, a transporter mechanism which would have transported the student, to the other side of the hall, right? So the most plausible ones are, just thinking about it intuitively, or that some student, hit the door, hit the button, cut a left, and the door closed. I don't see that student anymore. Yet another good explanation, right, would be that, the student, hit the button and, and it takes a few minutes for the door to close. So that gave them enough time to get to the other side. So, there's these are the competing explanations for the phenomenon, right? This phenomenon that I observed, of the door closing and, and these other facts, I observed, student going on the other side of the hall. Okay, so we use inference as the best explanation to to come up with the best explanation, right? And then we take that one to be the true one. Here's another example. I was in the hall, the hall, right? So right in front of my classroom, there's a bench. So there's a student there sitting on the bench, and then I walk another student. I was on my way to the door, but there was a student in front of me, and so they walk in front of the door, and then they walk they lunge towards the door, and I'm almost towards the student, right? And so I'm like, well, what is this person doing? Did they, are they trying to scare the student by lunging at them, right? Playing a trick on them? Or did, did they think they were going into the classroom and they realized at the last second, right? Oh, no, this is not a classroom. Oops, right? And so they back off. Which one of those things is the one, is the true explanation of what happened there, right? So again, you have two competing explanations, and intuitively we would say that that's probably the case that the student just accidentally thought they were going into a classroom, but realized at the last minute it was actually an office. Okay. So again, those are examples of how we make these inferences to the best explanation in our everyday lives, and they're used not only in our everyday lives at an intuitive level, but they're also used by the sciences. They're used by law, judges. Okay, so it's a very important argument for it, and it's well worth the time to learn it here. Here's some other examples that you'll get in the text. The new quarterback dropped the ball again. The best explanation for that screw up is that he's nervous. So he's probably nervous. How about the second one here? The best explanation for Maria's absence today is that she's angry at the boss. Yep, she's mad at the boss. Or this last one, which is like the example I gave, defendant's fingerprints were all over the crime scene, and so forth, right? Other bits of evidence. The only explanation for all this that makes any sense is that the defendant actually committed the crime. He's guilty. Okay, so in an inference to the best explanation, if the explanations are best, then it's a strong argument. If they have two premises, it's also cogent. Right, so we're using, again, the evaluative criteria that is associated with induction, since it's a form of induction. And another thing here is that a couple of other points. The explanation always goes beyond the evidence, right? So it tries to explain the facts by a hypothesis that is not derived entirely from the facts. Right, so you're always going to have, in an inference to the best explanation, a set of facts phenomenon, right? Call those facts the phenomenon that need to be explained. Okay, so the phenomenon doesn't explain itself, right? If it explained itself, then we wouldn't need, an inference. We wouldn't need an explanation of it, right? It'd be self-explanatory, right? But given that, we have some phenomenon that we're trying to understand better for whatever reason that is, maybe we're trying to find the perpetrator of a crime. Maybe we're trying to explain, some observations that we're making in our everyday lives. Maybe we're trying to do science and trying to, discover the best explanation for phenomenon, like that the sky is blue. Whatever be the case, right? We are looking for an explanation that goes beyond the evidence, right? I mean, it just doesn't take, the evidence itself and offer us, a tautology, right? You know, this is, the explanation of this is, the explanation of X is X, right? That would be like a tautology. It'd just be repeating what's in the phenomenon. But, so, we want something that goes beyond the phenomenon, right? And that sheds light on the phenomenon, that increases understanding of the phenomenon. And also that there are best explanations implies that that all not explanations are equally good. I mentioned that before.